Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Governing Intimacies in Lockdown and Load Shedding. At least 3 of us are load shed today, so please bear with us if things get a bit choppy. I'm sure it'll be fine. So my name is Srila Roy, and I'm Associate Professor at Wits University in Sociology, where I lead a research project funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation called Governing Intimacies. And basically this webinar series continues what the project has been doing, which is to facilitate collaborations and conversations on gender, sexuality, intimacy, politics across the Global South, specifically on India and South Africa. So today we have 2 incredible speakers, 2 women who are going to talk about 2 other incredible women who they've recently written and published about. As part of a book series called Voices of Liberation, which has been published by the HSRC Press. Professor Shireen Hassim is Canada 150 Research Chair in Gender and African Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa and visiting professor at Wits Wiser. Shireen is the author and editor of a number of books, including the award-winning Women's Organizations and Democracy, Contesting Authority. As with many things that Shireen pioneered at her time at Wits, Governing Intimacies is indeed her idea, her project, her baby, and without her, literally none of this would be possible. So Shireen, it's really special to have you here.
Thank you.
Grace Musila is Associate Professor at African Literature at Wits University. She's the author of Death Retold in Truth and Rumor, Kenya, Britain, and the Julie Ward Murder, which, Grace, I still haven't read, and I really have to. Every time I look at that blurb, I'm like, yeah, this sounds like a potboiler more than an academic work of excellence. And she's also the co-editor of Rethinking Eastern African Intellectual Landscapes. Thank you so much for agreeing to be here, Grace, under all these crazy circumstances. So Shireen's contribution to the book series and what she's going to talk about today is on the South African activist and academic Fatima Meer. And Grace's contribution to the same series is on the renowned environmentalist, human rights champion, and Nobel Prize winner, Wangari Maathai. Grace is going to speak first, followed by Shireen. Before they start, I just want to introduce you to Nehama. Those of you who've been following us will have known Nehama. She was in fact the first speaker on our series. And Nehama is going to take your questions. Please, can I just remind you to use the Q&A function for your questions, not the chat functions. Otherwise it just confuses us a little bit. But what I said right at the start, and just to say again, it'd be really super if you could introduce yourselves in the chat function. We have such a great audience, but we would obviously like to get to know you a bit more. I mean, we see some of the same names every 2 weeks, but yeah, it'd be a great way to keep this conversation going beyond this space. And as ever, thank you so much for joining in, and to our speakers. Grace, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Srila, and thank you to the Governing Intimacies team, and particularly to Nehama, Kayo, and Eurisha for putting this together, and to Shireen for all the work with the HSRC Press and for this exciting conversation that we're about to have. So my book is a biographical portrait of the scholar, environmental activist, human rights champion, community organizer, political leader, daughter, wife, mother, and the Nobel Prize laureate, Professor Wangari Maathai. I framed the book around the legacy of her life, thought, and activism as directed to the pursuit of freedom and dignified life for various communities, particularly vulnerable communities, which included women, rural communities, prisoners, Kenyans, Africans, and citizens of the Global South, burdened with international debt. Maathai pursued freedom in collaboration with different communities through her writing, the Greenbelt Movement, the Release Political Prisoners Initiative, the Jubilee 2000 campaign for global debt cancellation, as well as political office in her capacity as a Deputy Minister of Environmental Affairs and an elected MP. My book is titled Wangari Maathai's Registers of Freedom because Maathai's work, life, and thought embody different registers of freedom in the full meaning of the term register as bearing witness, recording, acknowledging, and responding to suppressions of freedom and well-being produced by the trinity of colonial violence, capital, and patriarchy. Maathai's life story is generative for me as a student of gender, Africa, and the politics of knowledge production, because it blends together an unusual mix of Gikuyu epistemology, formal education in biological sciences, activist practice, and political thought. Her life and thought demonstrates an activist and scholarly practice of pragmatic mobilization of multiple epistemic ancestries and repurposing of what we need while setting aside what no longer serves our best interests. And in this way, she embraces elements of Gikuyu cosmology and weaves it together with scientific perspectives while retaining a critical eye on the workings of patriarchy, capital, and white supremacist thought. So Maathai's life, and she was born in 1940 and passed on in 2011. Her life overlaps with Kenyan and to a certain extent African histories in ways that offer a glimpse of the workings of repression, aspirations to freedom, as well as the betrayals of such freedom dreams during a period spanning from British colonial Kenya all the way across 3 regimes in post-independent Kenyan history and their accompanying interactions with global history. At the same time, her life traces a distinct trajectory of class formation in colonial and post-colonial Kenya and the options and hurdles that frame women's lives. So in this book, I wanted to flesh out the shorthand of this figure of the Nobel Peace Laureate and just flesh out and put in a bit of detail about the woman behind that achievement, and also track the multifaceted activities and ideas in the local context that led to that recognition. I found her work and her life story productive for thinking about 6 sets of ideas, and could talk about a whole lot more, but I'll just talk to 6 of them. Firstly, private-public dichotomies in women's lives, particularly in contexts that remain anxious about ambitious, high-achieving women. Secondly, nego-feminist practice is a strategic and pragmatic approach to such hostile contexts. And thirdly, activist thought and practice as intellectual labor, and the task of rendering activists' ideas legible across communities that place an accent on different hierarchies of knowledge. Fourth, the strategic mobilization of indigenous epistemologies as a resource that can be reactivated in addressing modern challenges. Fifth is a question of ecological thought and interventions that particularly center the everyday needs of the poor, not the leisure needs of the white tourist class and the Black middle class. And lastly, the connections between food security, environmental conservation, and women's control over their reproductive health. And she explored this by emphasizing the need to manage population growth for sustainable resource use. So when Maathai passed on in 2011, tributes expectedly poured in from all over the world. What stood out in these tributes was the loud silence about Maathai's personal and public battles with Kenyan patriarchy, both in her marriage and in the Kenyan political landscape. Yet Maathai's work and thought was held together by a deep concern about the fate of women in a world that disregards our voices and thoughts, even as we disproportionately bear the brunt of poverty, colonial violence, environmental degradation, and authoritarian cultures. Maathai's pursuit of environmental justice and democratic freedoms retained a keen eye on the interlocking dimensions at play in the production of precarity and harm for multiply vulnerable communities. And so her work embodied intersectional thinking long before intersectionality was a trendy conceptual framework. And she demonstrated fluid organic linkages between scientific thought, activist mobilizing, practical action at grassroots levels. She considered the link between action and critical thought to be indispensable to world making, and constantly pursued the synergy between scientific ideas, activism, and practical change making. And of course, she's best known in relation to the Green Belt movement, which is an environmental and social justice movement which used tree planting and civic education as methods of addressing the harsh effects of environmental degradation and political repression in the lives of rural women and poor communities in Kenya. The movement started as a direct response to rural women's challenges in contrast to the conservation industry in Kenya, which is an offshoot of white masculinist colonial conservation practices that are associated with forced displacement of people, land alienation, and leisure consumption. In her work then, trees map a spectrum of ideas. They point to British ecological damage in East Africa and harmful conceptions of development that unleash mass poverty and degradation. They also symbolize cultural rootedness and ambitious futures. And through her work, tree planting became a process of cultivating democratic change and renewing grassroots democracy. She saw tree planting as an aspirational act of faith in a future we may not be around to witness, an intergenerational act of optimism and investment in a communal future, as Rob Nixon has described it. So essentially then my book traces the double story of Maathai's life story, in the sense that I'm interested in her narrated self, how she represents herself and her ideas and her life story, as well as her narrating self. The ups and downs of her personal life as a private individual, as well as the struggles and victories of her public life, invite us to pause and think about the promise of freedom and the utopian dreams of women and other vulnerable communities at different points in history. So across the book, then some of the ideas I look at are firstly questions of gender in the economy, particularly across colonial and post-colonial Kenya, and the ways in which migrant labor, his systems, tapped young men to work in white-owned cash crop farms while limiting women to subsistence farming and reproductive and care labor in the so-called native reserves. The introduction of wage labor and cash crop farming targeting only men meant that while women were confined to subsistence economy and domesticity, men were socialized into capitalism as wage earners and cash crop producers, and subsequently into political leadership as assistants to colonial administrators. A second idea that I explore is gender and travel. And part of the question I ask is, what happens when women travel? So the policing of women's mobility in many societies was not only out of economic concerns, it was also out of recognition that, as the Kenyan historian Tabitha Kanogo has noted, when women travel, it's not just their bodies that travel, their outlooks also shift. Maathai's travels from her home to Catholic boarding schools and later to the US and Germany for university education shifted her thoughts about race and gender. And she was in the US in the 60s at the beginnings of both the civil rights and the women's rights movements. And part of this exposure then developed her growing awareness about the church's cultural chauvinism as well as Euro-American cultural imperialism. The third strand I explore is what I mentioned earlier about women's professional and educational achievements at a time when women were largely absent from the higher levels of academia and public life, and the kinds of pragmatic choices it forced them to make. And lastly, colonial environmental degradation and the ways in which British colonial presence in Kenya and the kinds of choices that were made around farming and hunting and deforestation had huge implications for environmental damage in Kenya. So in closing then, through the Greenbelt movement, Maathai rejected the deficit model that sees poor rural women as victims awaiting handouts and messianic interventions, and instead demonstrated that what vulnerable communities need is empowerment through skills and resources to unlock their potential and translate their ideas and labor into livable lives. Maathai uses the metaphor of a traditional three-legged stool, which would ordinarily be carved from one piece of wood, to explain the interconnection between democratic governance, resource management, and peace. The three legs represent three critical pillars of just and stable societies. The first leg represents democratic space where rights are respected. The second represents sustainable and equitable management of resources, while the third stands for cultures of peace that are deliberately cultivated within communities and nations. The basin or the seat of the stool then represents society and its prospects for development. And ultimately her point was that unless all three legs are in place supporting the seat, no society can thrive. I think I'll stop there and we can explore some of these ideas in more detail later on. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Grace. And also, which hopefully we'll talk about after Shireen, how you curated, well, this person's voice. Yeah, so we'll wait for that. But thank you so much. Shireen?
Thanks very much, Srila, and Nakama, Kayo, Eurisha, who've done the background work, and I'm so happy to be on a panel with Grace. Let me start by just sort of positioning both our books a little bit in the series called Voices of Liberation, which is an HSRC series. Pumla Kola and I were both on the board at a certain point when we raised the very obvious issue that the HSRC was commissioning a lot of men to write about a lot of men. And, we both said, where are the women? And the usual discussions began, they're not, are there so many women? Have women written? That was a kind of question that came up. And within about 5 minutes, Pumla and I had listed a range of women who indeed had written and contributed. And so at the end of it, what you see coming out are the first of the products of the books that were commissioned as a result of that intervention. So I'm really pleased that that Grace is among the first of those. I also have to say that I did write on Fatima Meer, and I blame Pumla entirely for that, because this was her idea. And my first response to her was, why? Why should I write about an Indian woman? Because I'm an Indian woman, etc. So we can talk a little bit about those difficulties. But I'm very glad that I did. Now, the series is structured in it's a particular kind of a book, right? It is about curating the words, the writings, as well as the life. It's not just the biography. So what Grace and I have both done is write a biography that frames our selection of their work. And that in itself is a massive task of building an archive. And so I think both all these books that include women's work are part of the process of building a decolonial archive that sees women and places women within the corpus of literature. I'm not going to talk a huge amount about the details of Fatima Meer's life. I want to actually just raise some of the issues that I've had in doing this work. And so the first thing I want to say is the difficulty of writing biography. And I'll relate this to my own difficulties with her, writing her life. Kierkegaard said that life is lived forwards, but is understood backwards, which seems to capture for me the difficulty we all have in dealing with everybody has a complicated life, small and great, no matter how meaningful or not a life is. So this I think presents a tension that there's a tendency when we look at the life of a person to try and read some coherence into it, to make a narrative of it, or to select a narrative device that would create the subjectivity of that person, right? That we all establish a storyline, we develop a kind of linearity that allows us to see what is central to that life. And for political figures like Fatima Meer, it's really the struggle that is the central thing. So in many of the biographies of struggle figures are looking at those moments and acts of heroism, the kinds of hardships that were overcome, and placing somehow those actions within the inevitability that they would confront injustice in some larger frame. And then you kind of go and try to look for the personal that connects to the larger story. For me, the problem with doing that, the thing I struggled with, is that there's really, when you do that, you're shrinking the gap between past and present in some ways that are quite problematic. So what the person became at the end of their life defines the narrative of all of her life. You're kidding me, Nakam, I'm only on my first paragraph. So I'm trying to take a different approach, and I'm going to speed it up. So if it is about history, I think what I'm trying to do here is more akin to what Jane Kamensky calls an inside-out accounting of the daily lives of desire and freedom. So these lives that are structured by all of these other factors, that we try to recover something from the inside out of a period, of a time. And in the case of Fatima Meer, for practically the whole of a century, really. But how do we then go about framing it? Is this a narrative of a generation? Because she was certainly part of a golden generation. I don't think so. I think there's too much diversity in her story to make her stand for a whole group. Is it the problem? It's the same with a social class, right? I don't think she was representative. That seems to think of her as illuminating these larger patterns feels a little too grandiose and a little too dismissive of the particularity of her life, her hopes, her struggles. What I do think it is, and that this particular genre of the Voices of Liberation series enables us to do, is explore the relationship between lives as experienced and the ideas that find their way into political theorizing and into forms of activism. And I understand here the danger that one might have, you end up conflating personality with politics. So just because someone, for example, is a risk taker, you start to think radicalism is the obvious path, like a personal risk taker. So I just want to say, I want to make a very modest claim for the value of the genre of biography. The second thing I want to say is that it's not a biography in the conventional sense, and because I'm trying to think through Fatima Meer as an intellectual, which is not generally the way in which women are written about in the sort of struggle arena, right, in the political arena. They're thought of as activists, and I want to think of her as a theorist as well. I did have a simple sketch of her life. You know, she was born, she grew up, she got married, she had children, she died, etc. But that's only a starting point, not the rationale for the book. So it's not a conventional biography. And to do a conventional biography, in fact, I would have needed a different kind of an archive. And we could talk about that too in the discussion. I already, given difficulties I've already had with her heirs, I think it would be almost impossible to get access to the archive of her personal papers. So I'm not trying to make a life for the dead and gone, as Carolyn Steedman might say. I'm kind of, so I'm not really, in many ways, I feel I haven't quite mastered that biography part of it. Particularly for a feminist, of course, that lack of access to the personal, to the private, acted as a great limitation on what I could say about her personal choices. Her own memoir was only slightly useful to me because it's very wonderful on her early life. But as she begins to write about her adult life, she in fact gives a very sanitized account. It's eviscerated of tensions. It's very romanticized. It's very, you know, so her memoir was interesting for what it didn't say as much as for what it did say. There's a lot to be gained for this way of thinking of an inside-out accounting of history through a life. Because I think what it does is take us to the affective landscape of 20th century South Africa, the hurts, the resentments, the daily small injustices, and the small stuff of race. And I think there's a merit also to studying someone like Fatima, who is just outside the view of historians for a lot of reasons we can talk about. Race, gender, maybe even her personality. She's just outside of the ways, the archives that historians have drawn on for the 20th century. From the perspective of standing just outside from the sidelines, you might see something that is outside of sanctioned narratives. And then when you begin to actually look at her writing and her activism, you see the signs of her presence. I have a whole lot I wanted to say about what she said about the multiple racial regimes that operated through 20th century South Africa, and the ways in which she both documented those, critiqued those, and refused certain kinds of categories of race. I think we see in her writing, and I encourage people to read it, what Karen and Barbara Fields call racecraft, how race was made over the course of the 20th century in the context of empire, and defined, so this very unstable category. You can actually see how unstable it is at the beginning of her life, and how through processes of apartheid, certain categorical binaries are stabilized. I wanted to talk, you can ask me in questions, actually, because, you know, you see what the notion of the absolutization of race emerging through the 20th century in her life and in her engagements with the state, and in her theorization of the everyday lives of people. So her work very much stood against the classificatory blueprints of the state. Because, and she was, yes, time's up, I know. So ask me something about that, because I want to say something about Indians and the ways in which Indians have been also made outsiders in the conversation of race, and been kind of a disposable category in the ways in which people writing about race have kind of not written about the figure of the Indian. Fatima has a lot to say about that. She also has a lot to say about women, and she was among the earliest pioneers of the task of beginning to document the lives of women workers in particular. So I'll come back to that, and if you are interested in questions, but my time's up. Sorry. Sorry.
Sorry, no, sorry. I mean, I think, yeah, we're just policing a bit too robustly, because we are getting
anxiety develops as you are talking.
Yeah. But in that spirit, I will be just very brief and give you both, I mean, Shireen, you've already started to reflect on that, but just to give you both an opportunity to reflect on the process of curation, right? So, and Grace, you didn't have an opportunity to say that, so I hope you will now. Just to say, I mean, yeah, what did it mean to write this life? And, you know, our broader theme was, of course, writing women. But I was also curious, and you can or you cannot respond to this, about where the books have landed, right? How have the books, I suppose, how they've been received by particular audiences? I mean, I actually assigned Shireen's book to my class last year, and I was very surprised how this particular, I mean, not that they're representative, I mean, they were only 10 students, but they knew very little about Fatima Meer. And that kind of surprised me. So I'm just curious about, well, yeah, the process of curation and where these books have landed. And then we'll open up to questions, and definitely I will ask you the question on racializing Indian if no one else does.
Okay, I could go first, and I think I'll start with your second question. And thank you so much, Shireen, for just those thoughts around biography and around the implications of working with these, the women we're working with. I think the second question is easy for me because my book just came out at the beginning of the year, and then me and my book and all of us went into lockdown. So this is practically the first public conversation we're having about the book. And so far I've seen one review in a Nairobi newspaper, which I thought was really generous and thoughtful. And it would be interesting to see then how the book travels going forward. And then the process of curating, so it's a very particular kind of book and a very particular structure that we're working with within the HSRC Voices of Liberation model. And for me, it presented two challenges. Firstly, how to pack into a short biographical essay as much detail as possible on the complexities and the layers of Maathai's life, and to really flesh it out, because the version of her that is known out there is primarily the environmentalist and the Nobel Peace Prize laureate. But the version that's known on the ground in Kenya has a lot more layers, and I wanted to bring both of those versions to the table. And then at the same time, I also I wanted to include as many strands of her thoughts as possible, because she's written 3 essay collections as well as her memoir, and then there's been lots of scholarly engagement with her work. And so I was interested in giving at least little tasters of each of these voices, thoughts, ideas, but at the same time also being attentive to the different publics or communities within which she's been received or she has engaged with. And then lastly, I drew a lot on the press because, and I talk about it in the book, the ways in which she was very strategic in her use of the media for her political and activist work. And so for me, it was interesting to trace her, in a way, the patterns of her presence in the Kenyan press. And so those are the archives that I was drawing on, basically the 3 essay collections, her memoir, other people's work about her, as well as then her presence in the Kenyan media.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it was an enormous task of building an archive with Fatima Meer, because her work is scattered all over the place, and there's a huge amount of it, ranging from books to opinion pieces, to interviews, to journal articles, to, you know, it's just all, in fact, it's a huge archive. Some of it, as is inevitable, was a repetitive archive. So, you know, then I had to sit down with the work and think about which were the ones that best reflected her ideas, which sometimes, as academics do, you publish an idea in a multiplicity of ways. Some work better than others and so on. So I had to adjudicate that. I had huge amounts of material to adjudicate. And then there was also the task of, which you know, was just really so difficult. And I did have a little bit of support from Charlotte Imani at the HSRC Press, which was really helpful to think about what we would do with work where there were things that were slightly like inaccurate sometimes, you know, which again happens, right? In just, yeah. So there were a lot of curatorial decisions to be made. But what I tried to do was to select a range of texts that represented the breadth of her thinking, and that were provocative, and that spoke also to the future, that weren't parochially engaged in a debate. So that's how I went about trying to do this. And I was fortunate that the HSRC agreed to give me a few more pages in order to kind of use, it's quite a fat book. There would have been even more. I mean, this is someone who's written, like, you know, dozens of books and hundreds of articles. So to read through all of that, select, I mean, this is, in some ways, this is my reading of her. Somebody going into the full collection of her writing may come up with a different kind of selection. I don't know if that answers your question, Srila.
No, it does. Do you want to say something about how it's been received, circulated, or we can move on to the Q&A?
Yeah, I don't know what I want to say about that. I mean, after the book came out, there has been a little bit of a battle over whether my name should be on the book or not, because her heirs were not happy, and so that's kind of colored the process of disseminating it, made it a little more difficult. Yeah, which is a question we should raise. Who has rights to a life? Who owns a life that is past? You know?
Depending on how you all feel, we've got questions queuing up, amazing questions. So when you're ready to jump in there, but I wanted to, I mean, the problem, unfortunately, when you listen to this, and the reason why I have to police so robustly is because I get so distracted listening and taking notes that I also forget to watch the time, because I am so consumed and so rewarded by listening to each of you speak that it's important to sort of keep the time going. Otherwise, you know, we'd forget. But what really did occur to me, Shireen, was I was reminded of trying to write about Sissy Gul when I was working on a history of Cape Town, and that similar feeling where you have a woman who has a very particular perception in the public's past that doesn't necessarily always integrate with how we might want to narrate her life in the future. And there's often a lot of pushback in terms of that. But that would be my question, and that would be unfairly jumping the queue. So Srila, with permission, can I start asking some of the audience questions? So just a reminder to everybody on the chat is, first of all, please keep chatting on the side. The chat box is for you to use and to discuss if you want to. But if you have questions for Shireen and for Grace, to submit them using the Q&A side. And so we'll start with a question that's for both Shireen and Grace, where the audience member asks, can you speak to the fine line between biography and autobiography, and the ways, if any, in which your own lives became intertwined with writing about these women's lives? And I suppose that also extends to being immersed in their archives. So if I can start with Grace and then go to Shireen, is how did that sort of impact on your own life, I suppose, to write about these women? Grace?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a difficult one as well, because by virtue of our academic training, we are supposedly trained to really remove ourselves from the subject and to be as distant as possible. But it's only possible to pull that off so far, especially when you're writing about subjects who you're very invested in, not just as scholarly subjects, but also at a personal level. So I think for me, anybody reading this, and I was listening to Shireen saying earlier about how if somebody else wrote another sort of biographical project on Fatima Meer, they would come up with a different book. And I'd be interested to see the kinds of other portraits that a different kind of author, differently positioned, differently politicized, might come up with. I think for me, I felt strongly about certain issues, and probably that accent filters through in my framing of Maathai's work. Especially, I felt strongly about her very anecdotal engagement with questions of the policing of ambitious women and highly successful women. And so I try to flesh that out probably a lot more in my book than she does in her own life story. I also felt strongly about the question of, in a way, social justice projects that are very much invested in a different understanding of poor rural women and such communities as not passive victims. And I think I probably accented that more strongly than a different biographer with different investments might do, probably.
I actually wrote down when I was taking notes during your talk, and I cannot wait to get this book. And like you, I've also had books come out during lockdown, so I'm really sad that it might not have reached as wide an audience as it could have, but I hope there's a chance. But yes, this policing of sort of ambitious women, which I find so interesting also because both of you are obviously very powerful, acknowledged, widely known women, and you're both academics and intellectuals. And here you are, as Shireen was saying, that's sort of doing history sort of, you know, from the inside out, but it's kind of creating an academic or an intellectual life for these women who in their own lifetimes, I mean, were very much so, obviously Maathai being, working at a university, but were not always regarded as such because women were just not written about in that same way. So it is really interesting how history has policed that and how these books present an opportunity to sort of address that. Shireen, what was your feeling, I mean, in terms of writing about Fatima Meer and how it sort of influenced your own life or intertwined with your own life?
Yeah, there's a superficial obviousness to this, Fatima Meer, Durban, small community, academic, all of these, intersections between her positionality and mine, even though there's a temporal lag. And I also knew her when I was a student, right? So now she was a familiar in a number of ways. In a number of other ways, she was not familiar. So, there's a big class divide, for example, between me and her. I was very much from the wrong side of the tracks. She's comes from a celebrated family with, a very public family. What was really, I would say, connection for me lay in her writing, because she really documented the lives of poor people. And for much of the century, that those poor people in Durban and surrounds were Indian people. Indians were extremely poor. And so in a way, she documented the kind of world I knew very well, the spaces I moved through as a child. And I thought she captured that with such resonance. She need not have, right? She could have been a different kind of an academic, but she was the kind of academic who went into poor areas, who took seriously not only the deprivations of poverty, but she also paid attention to things that I'm familiar with coming from those communities, which is that it's culturally rich, that is full of joy and life and aspiration and aesthetics. And she does all of that, particularly in Portrait of Indians, which I think is one of the most remarkable books about South Africa, actually. So I could connect with all of those parts of her life. I thought her, accessing what it was to be in a white university for a woman of color in the middle of the century and going into the late 20th century was a really, really interesting process. And again, a sort of this hit of familiarity, like seeing something that she had encountered that we still all continue to encounter in the academy, right? Which she kind of gave some name to, I would say, and words to. So that I tried to capture that part of it in the book, because I was able to access that correspondence. I could use it in interesting ways.
What also struck me listening to both of you, not only talk about your experiences of writing, but also the woman, was listening to recent accounts, how contemporary these issues remain. And again, going back to kind of Wangari Maathai's, is the issues of how environmentalism is still used to police women's bodies and women's abilities to travel safely or experience different spaces is still so present. I mean, I'm thinking, Srila, of the talks that we had last year in Delhi, where we were, listening to people talk about women's abilities to kind of even using outdoor toilets and that sort of stuff, but how many of these issues are still incredibly resonant today. Another question that's been submitted, and I'm going to slightly tweak the phrasing because it's asking about the idea of contradiction. But when you work with somebody's archive, you inevitably come up, I found in my work with history, you come up with a certain number of things that challenge the notion of a hero, that maybe don't cast the person in a flattering light, or that are a contradiction between their professed ideals or their ideologies. And so the question to both of you is, how did you either address or incorporate contradictions between the personal and the political, between competing ideologies? And I want to add to that framing, how do you address the limitations? You know, there must have been areas where they failed in their different lives. And were you able to include that? And I don't know who would like to answer that first. I'll sort of...
Are you ready, Shireen?
Well, you know, that's, yeah, that's inevitable, right? That it's inevitable that there will be parts of every life where you've done things that are questionable or that others might question. And even if you have resolved yourself to that position, they're not necessarily what others would agree with. I mean, for me, the issue I struggled with most when I was writing this was the Fatima Meer's response to Salman Rushdie, and the ways in which he dealt with whether or not he should visit South Africa just after the Satanic Verses was published. And her response to that, although it was complicated, and I tried to show the complications of her response, I think I fundamentally disagreed with how she understood that issue. I took a very different line on that. I mean, I was a young student at the time. I remembered it. I remembered my own feelings of absolute frustration at this idea that he was somehow reproducing a first world gaze on a third world, you know, issue. So I had a lot of problems with that. And the way in which I resolved it was to try, and I think this actually, if you are trying to do anything biographical, you have an ethical obligation to see the person with the most generous spirit that you can see, to try and find in that person's positioning the most generous interpretation or the best interpretation of what they were trying to do. You know, unless it is someone, obviously you're writing about that you absolutely can't stand by, in which case it's a different kind of a project. But in a kind of sympathetic portrayal, which is what I wanted to do from the beginning, and there's so much of her work and her life that I'm drawn to, that I think is important, that in those areas where I disagreed, my strategy was to take the ethical position of generosity while not suspending the critique. So I hope I achieved it in the way in which I wrote about that particular bit. What I see as unresolved in her issue, in her framing of that issue, I said what I saw as unresolved without, you know.
Grace, you have the added challenge of dealing with a Nobel laureate. And I mean, from my experience, the only Nobel laureate I've ever interviewed is Aung San Suu Kyi. And I mean, obviously so much retrospective rationalization required in terms of understanding her role in history. So even again, where a woman who I'd been raised, and at the time that I met her, quite a long time ago now, thought of as kind of a really noble figure, had some very difficult future aspects that I had to sort of integrate into her character. So you really are dealing with somebody who was iconic on a global stage. Did you find contradictions or challenges, and how did you integrate those?
I think, so Maathai was very aware and self-conscious about her location in public life, because she gets into public life very early because her husband goes into politics. So even that early in the day, she's very aware of herself as a public figure. And so she manages her ideas and her public projections very carefully. But I think two possible contradictions that I would say came across. One relates to my earlier comment around the forms of policing of successful women, where she talks about how increasingly after she gets back from the US, after her postgrad studies in the US, her and she's met her partner in the US. So he's also US educated, and they return to Kenya and they get married, and he has political ambitions, and she immediately starts reframing herself into a particular mode of femininity. And she starts performing what she considers to be the template of a good African woman, because she doesn't want she doesn't want herself and her positioning to influence or interfere with her husband's public political ambitions. And I sort of was a bit troubled by that initially, but I appreciated the fact that by the time she's telling her life story decades later, she's able to think back to that moment. She doesn't linger on it. But for me, one way of dealing with that was to then locate her in that particular moment as, in a way, among a pioneer group of elite women in Kenya, and literally a group that doesn't have much to go with in terms of how do we work with upwardly mobile Black women? How do we work with ambition? How do you work with success? And she herself talks about how along the way this clearly did not work, because she felt, actually, on hindsight, the reason her marriage, one of the reasons her marriage did not work is because she was expected to be apologetic about her achievements, and she did not see why she should be apologetic about her achievements. And subsequently then, she says she wanted to live her life in such a way to show girls and women that you must never be apologetic about your achievements. Now, and I think there's a missing conversation around in feminist conversations, partly because we tend to think of poor, undereducated women as the victims of patriarchy. And so there is a whole conversation there that I think her work enables. Then a second controversial issue was her views on HIV and AIDS. And that, of course, made, it was a media controversy, actually, all over US media. And I think the Nobel Prize Committee had to issue a statement at some point defending her views, or at least clarifying her views, because she was quoted in the media as saying, there's something we don't know about HIV and AIDS, and there is a possibility that there might be some truth, or at the very least, we need to get to the bottom of the conspiracy theories about how HIV comes into the picture. Now, that was a little tricky to work with, especially coming from a scientist, a trained scientist, aside from, of course, her high profile and all that. But I think I appreciated her using her platform to put that conversation on the table, to say, maybe we need to take this seriously, and maybe there is need for further research and for further engagement with the kinds of assumptions people hold about HIV and AIDS. The third one, which time probably would not allow us to go into, but there were perceptions in sections of the Kenyan community that, despite her very vocal views on ethnicity and the problem of ethnicity, that she did not fully disrupt that in terms of the profile of employment within the Greenbelt movement offices in Nairobi.
This is such an important conversation, and that we can have it around women, because there seems to be this assumption that in order for somebody to be an important figure in the past, everything has to reconcile. And what we discover when we do works of biography or about people is we discover that there are many aspects that we cannot reconcile or not easily reconcile. Although I was thinking, I mean, for me, there's a lot of resonance, and I would imagine for many other people in this panel, and I won't say any names, but of women in positions of power or women in academia who are expected to be apologetic about their achievements, and how that forces them to confront not only men in the public sphere, but also the men in their intimate lives and in their personal lives, where male partners and husbands struggle to accept and understand women's achievements. And again, something that we continue to confront. And it is important that we're able to see that even these incredibly strong and lauded women had similar struggles, you know, that we can relate to. There are several questions that have come through from the audience about the archive. So if we can shift the conversation back onto the idea of the archive and curation for a moment. These also relate to, there's one question about intersectionality in the archive, but I want to focus specifically on women and the feminine in the archive. So the one question says, I'm curious to hear more about how the archive can shift how we understand women's lives and their impact on history, or is there a shift? And linked to that, somebody said, how can we think of a feminized archive? So I want to join those two questions together and ask, while you were doing your work, given that you were obviously writing about and including the writings of women who were prominently covered, what are your thoughts about the presence of these women, but also of other women in this the concept of the archive? Because, you know, in my own archival work, women are often invisible, a bit like those Victorian photographs where the mother is behind the baby, but she's sort of shrouded, so you can't see her holding the baby. So did you find women in the archives? Do you find a female history in the archives, not just of these prominent figures, but of the women around them? I mean, Shireen, you talk about Fatima visiting the communities. So maybe if we can switch back to Shireen for a moment and talk about the presence of other women in the archive that is peripheral to Fatima Meer's own biography.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Can I ask that some of these questions I'd like identify who's asking them? Could you do that? Would that be possible to say X asked?
Okay, so one is from an anonymous person.
To humanize our interactions.
Oh, sorry. Okay, no, that's a good point, and that's good to know. I'm going to find, so hold on, I have to find the correct ones. So the one is D. Legaga, and I don't know who that is.
Oh, Dina. Hi, Dina.
Okay. Wants to ask about, can the archive shift how we understand women's lives? And then the other one was unfortunately anonymous, which was to ask about thinking of a feminized archive. And there are a few more that link through to this. But if you look on the question and A box as well, the Q&A box, Shireen, you should be able to see it. You'll actually be able to see who's asking.
So it's hard to read and
sorry.
Focus at the same time. But so I feel like my entire life's work has been about expanding the archive so that women are no longer, what was Anne McClintock's phrase, displaced, dismembered, and sort of, exiled out of the archive. So yes, of course, I think we have to start to talk about what we understand to be archives, right? Mm-hmm. So some of the more conventional ways of thinking about archives would not find the things that we as feminists, but I think also social historians more generally go out and find as archives are often much broader and so much more expansive. And, we might begin to open a question about what does it mean to theorize, and whether, we begin, so, something that I have argued for in other work is to think also of the kinds of struggles that women engage in collectively and individually as forms of theorization, to the extent that they kind of draw certain kinds of very discernible connections and causal relationships and ways of thinking about the nature of society, to think about women's collective struggles, for example, in the ways in which women have put down demands in things like women's charters as forms of dreaming and utopianism, and richly so. Rather than only thinking of theory as the thing that is written using specific types of language and published in particular kinds of places. So yeah, I think opening up what we think of as archives is also a way of including all kinds of other voices, and seeing other kinds of contributions and having a fuller way of writing about those. Yeah, I mean, I could go on at length about that, because I think that is a lot of what feminist interventions are about, recasting the domain of the political.
And very much, there are some questions also coming through that talk about decolonization, but the notion of sort of decolonizing the archive is also shifting us away from a formal sort of inherited Western male-dominated written archive to expanding inclusivity of other, not only documents, but resources which exist often in spoken word, not necessarily in sort of a formal written sense. Grace, from your perspective, working with, I mean, media reports and writings and other things, what are your thoughts on sort of the presence or absence of women and in the archive, not just your subject herself, but kind of the women around her?
So I think in my case, what was great was that I was working with a subject who was very conscious about that set of questions around precisely aligning herself with a very female genealogy of thought, of ideas, partly because of her upbringing, that she's raised by her mother in her rural home, while her father works in a different town at a British-owned farm in sort of colonial Kenya. And so she grows up very closely with her mother, who wasn't literate, but who already, even at that young age, was already signaling to her a whole range of, in a way, forms of indigenous epistemologies around questions of the environment. And as an adult, she constantly links the scientific perspectives back to this genealogy of ideas that she draws from her mother. And she very much centers her mother as her first teacher, so to speak, around questions of environmental consciousness and conservation. But beyond that, also, she's very interested also in questions of storytelling, and she ties that to a maternal aunt Nyamwea, who was very much central to her worldview and her understanding of ideas around her community. In fact, she features the only appendix in her memoir is a story, her aunt's favorite story that she used to tell to the family. So I think right across her work, for me, part of what writing about Maathai meant weaving back and forth between the formal archives in terms of written content, in terms of media, print media reports, in terms of scholarly engagements with her work, but also weaving them back to oral archives, which were very central to the formation of her ideas. And these oral archives were very female oriented, and they're very much associated with women figures in her life. And ultimately then, of course, her own activist work is very much tied to women along the way. So I think, I hadn't even thought about it in that way, but thinking about it now, I'm noticing just how strong a female presence there was across the archives that I was working with.
What a nice experience.
Mm-hmm.
A question that's come through from Shweta, Shweta Krishnan, which I'm going to broaden to include both of you. It's come through for Shireen about the topic of Indians writing about Indians, because I think that this is you wanted to talk about this, and I think we can expand on this, because Shweta posts here, can you speak a little bit about the problem of the category of a native writer? I hear in native writing both an expectation that Indians should be interested in making other Indians legible, and an assumption that only Indians can really understand and translate Indian experiences for the world. In both cases, the audience seems located outside of this category of native. There's a very problematic hierarchy here in terms of geographies and in-place bodies. Can you talk about this? So I think that there is definitely relevance in both books here. Whereas, is this expectation, you know, that only an Indian woman can write about an Indian, a Black woman must write about a Black woman? What is this idea of the native writer? So Shireen, I'll come back to you and then come back to Grace on this, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm just going to say straight out here that I'm not on board with this sort of collapsing of experience and knowledge in that way, right? That seems to me a very simplistic way to assume that there's something more authentic merely by virtue and of the fact that we share some kind of ascribed ethnic or racial status. And there are many ways of responding from within the feminist tradition, from within the Black consciousness tradition, to this kind of very, I think, unsubtle way of making the connection. Being an insider and raises up a lot of question. An insider to what, and so, we don't share. I grew up in a different period, on a different side of the city, in a different caste grouping, with all kinds of differences. At the same time, there was, as I said, some degree of familiarity that made certain things easier. Certain things were easier to navigate because I completely understand the geography of the city, because I lived and grew up in and went to the university here. I mean, those things there's a familiarity, but that's not to say some other researcher coming in would not spot that familiarity. So I'm really not keen, and I want to say, I think that the outsider gaze has its own value, its own kind of, it opens up certain kinds of things that insiders simply don't see because they take so entirely for granted. So I think for us as writers and as academics and so on, the question of positionality is something that has to be engaged, not assumed, not presumed to give you a certain kind of insight, because as Biko said, you can be black skinned but have imbibed a kind, as it relates to the decoloniality question, but to be working within frameworks that we produce the current hierarchy of knowledge, for example. So there just cannot be that only an Indian woman of a certain class speaking a certain kind of language can gain access. I mean, we could have no scholarship, actually. We could have no human empathy, human connection, if that was the starting point. So I'm being overly strong in pushing back at that.
Don't tell Malcolm Gladwell that, because otherwise he'll start getting ideas. Grace, your thoughts on that sort of positionality? It's such a great discussion.
I have very strong views about this one because I think how do I start? So firstly, I'm very much in favor of insiders writing about insider stuff unapologetically. Partly because, again, as people of the global South, as Africans, we latecomers to this game of knowledge production within the academy. And by the time we get into the mix, there's an entire archive of knowledge, European-produced knowledge by Europeans who studied themselves, wrote about themselves. Nobody asked them, why are you writing about yourselves? Are you not worried about being a native, blah, blah, blah? The second thing is, even now, the global experts on the global South remain white Euro-Americans. And, I'm in African studies, Shireen is in African studies. The big names in African studies are primarily white Euro-Americans. There's a reason for that. It's about the infrastructure that enables white people, especially from the global North, but also on the continent even, to have greater mobility and access to archives, to spaces, to resources, to do the kind of research they want to do. If I wanted to do right now on Kenya, for instance, the big names on Kenya studies are British scholars, primarily British historians, and a sprinkling of Americans. If I was interested in some community in Britain, I would not, firstly, I wouldn't get the visa, the tickets, the access. Even if I could get myself there, they would not grant me access to that archive. So yeah, I feel very strongly about this one. I think if we must study whatever interests us, and I think insiders should never feel apologetic about studying their own communities firstly. Secondly, that assumption of insiderism, and I'm not being hardcore on the question, obviously. I think it's an important question, so I'm not targeting this so much to the person asking it as to the larger conversation about this, because it comes up a lot. But it also depends on an assumption, which Shireen was noting today, that Africans or Southern communities are homogeneous, that we share so much, that we know each other, but we're not. So there are all sorts of flattening assumptions that are happening there, but also the flip side, and I'll then stop on this note, but my first book was actually, in a way, a different version of a biographical project on a white woman. And I can't tell you the number of times at events, people really try to pussyfoot around asking me, how did you get to, like, why are you interested in writing about a white woman? They never ask it directly like that, because of course it's awkward, but that's normally the implicit question. Like, what happened here? Why is a black Kenyan woman writing about a white British woman? So whichever way we do it, there'll always be questions. But for me, there are all sorts of infrastructural and historical and resource issues involved there. And as at now, I fully encourage people to write about whichever communities they feel like writing about.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to underscore some of the other reasons that Grace gave for why we should value insiders writing. Of course, I don't mean to dismiss that. I mean, there is an absolutely dire need for us to all be writing about the worlds that we live in, because otherwise we are endlessly studied from outside. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to agree with that part of it, but that's a different, you know, I think we're agreed, Grace. That's one consideration. Mm-hmm. But on the consideration of necessarily knowing better, that's an open question. Yeah.
I think, but that's what's interesting about it, and I think Grace's point was correct, is that when women write about women, there's often a question of, well, what entitles you to write about this woman, or what qualifies you to write about this woman beyond simply being a woman? Whereas typically nobody asks men what qualifies them. And I mean, this includes men who've written guides to childbirth and breastfeeding, you know, where they never get challenged about their qualifications. And what's interesting here is that women are challenged, challenged or assumed. And I think that, you know, what Shireen said really kind of resonated, that, you know, that we must be engaged, but not assumed or presumed to actually have some kind of specific qualification beyond our actual professional and academic qualifications, which are always somehow sort of relegated to secondary when it comes to writing biographies. I want to end, because we have, obviously, it's already 4:15. I want to end by, again, borrowing a question from an audience member, from Vincenza, who asks a question for both Magical Humans. And I do want to say this has been such a great session. One of the questions has been to ask, can we have a part 2, please, so that we can continue this conversation. And Vincenza asks, how did you manage the politics of writing the lives of incredibly significant women while navigating the demands of the political present to decolonize the archive and the academy, the demands of the academy for production of particular kinds of life histories, and the ethical obligation to not write into being what these women and these historical subjects did not want known? But I want to sort of add to that a tweak, where we know that currently women academics in particular are producing less. They're submitting less, they're writing less. So there is, you know, new information coming out of the current pandemic situation, where we know that women are submitting fewer articles to journals to be published, because the burden of certain care is falling more heavily on women during this time. So I want to ask a dual question of, how did you write and create this, given the current realities, let's say pre-pandemic, but also keeping in mind that the pandemic is once again going to shift women's abilities to be present in the archive, to produce documents or artifacts or records, or to be part of the record in a certain way. How do women become part of an archive of the future, however we want to define archive, in a sense, you know? Grace?
I think it's a very loaded question, and I'm not sure I'll do justice to it. But I had less of that struggle. An element of the question is about aspects that one had to withhold from writing about in the books. I didn't have that problem with this particular project because, like I said, I was dealing with a subject who was very self-conscious about her public location. I had that challenge with my first book because it was a controversial case, because it involved, of course, it involved a rape and a murder and a woman whose sexual morality was being questioned. So with my first book, I had to be very careful about presenting the academic truth as it appeared to me, while at the same time having an ethical obligation to my subject, considering her fate. And again, it's a different conversation. But yes, that came up for me in that book in ways that it didn't come up for me. And I had to, and I was more attached to treading around her life story and her horrible murder with a certain degree of integrity around what was at play and around just honoring her dignity in her life in different ways that my current project, I think, didn't make those kinds of demands. Then in relation to decolonizing knowledge production, I think for me, I was very conscious of the fact that I was writing about a subject whose training is in biological sciences, and a lot of whose writing is very much tied to her activist work. And I'm conscious of the fact that a lot of, first of all, women's thought generally tends to be treated dismissively, but also broadly in the academy, especially in the humanities, there's a certain attachment to particular registers of theorization that Shireen was mentioning earlier. So there's a risk of Maathai's immense innovative thought and contribution being brushed aside as not conceptually sophisticated. And I think for me, it was important to me that, so for me, that's my approach to decolonizing certain assumptions about knowledge, that it was important for me that my book is able to really distill the core intellectual insights of her work that might not immediately appear to be that sophisticated to people who look for sophistication dressed in particular registers. So I think that was, for me, that was my approach to the questions of how do we reframe knowledge production?
Shireen, your thoughts on writing, obviously, about or this subject in the present, and again, what this might mean for future women who want, you know, who we may write about?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, I've written about two very difficult women in the last 5 years. I've written quite a bit now about Winnie Mandela, who, of course, was a dear friend of Fatima, and they were of a type, I have to say, both very forceful, opinionated, difficult, complicated women. So, I can only say that my approach to writing both of them, in the end, even given that I have a long history of involvement in feminist political struggles, and I've belonged to women's organizations, and my approach to writing about them has been to take a scholarly perspective, as Grace says she did as well. So that is where I enter the conversation, and to do it from a scholarly perspective is both a reassuring and a problematic thing, right? It's reassuring because we have these tools that we can use. We're attuned to certain ways of being critical about the material we engage with, being able to access a range of different sources and an understanding of context and so on. And that kind of, I found a comforting way of approaching these two lives. There are other ways of writing. I mean, I think, I often refer to the contrast between, for example, the way in which I wrote about Winnie Mandela and the way in which Sisonke and Simang wrote in a register that was much more personalized, in which there was more perhaps relating to the earlier question, that sense of closeness of a younger feminist to an older, a kind of mother-daughter conversation. And that is also a brilliant genre, because it opened up a different way of thinking about the person, right? So they're just different modes of writing. It's not that one is correct and the other is not. Each gives you a set of tools and lenses almost that illuminate different kinds of things. So there you can see two different ways of approaching the same subject. Mm-hmm. And I hope readers who read Sisonke's work and those who read mine will take away different kinds of things from that process. On the question that Vinny asked of how do you do this as academics? Well, I hope that sort of slightly answers that question, but I've never let the academy set the terms of what I think is my work or the questions I should ask. And that's a straightforward response that may not be helpful for younger academics coming into a highly competitive, neoliberalized academy. I think it is slightly different, and I think there's much more for young academics at the moment. There's much more herding. I just haven't made my academic career in that way. I will continue to write for Agenda, even though Agenda doesn't get counted for a large part of my academic CV. It's not counted as a significant publication, but it's a space where South African and African feminists are debating. So for me, continues to be important to engage there too.
I'm kind of wanting, that's like a call to action actually almost, which is quite exciting, even in an academic space. We have gone very much over time. So, but I really feel quite stirred by these discussions. I mean, as a middle-aged woman in academia who has not been in this space for a very long time, it does tend to want to restrict the presence of women in archives to very acceptable forms. And if you're a difficult woman and you use forms that are not considered acceptable, you will be considered as not counting in the archive. But as both of you know, is that history will tell a different story, perhaps. History won't be checking on
well, if we tell that story, if more of us tell the stories, history doesn't automatically redeem anybody, unfortunately. It's a matter of an intervention into the archive. That's the whole point of what we're doing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Grace, I don't know if you want to add anything, and then I'm going to hand back to Srila.
No, I think that's a perfect note on which to end, because I think what's at stake is larger than the kinds of immediate projects we're working on. It's really about an ongoing insistence on, in a way, opening up spaces that enable us to do the kind of work that honors our thinking, and hopefully then by implication honors a larger understanding of the humanity. So I completely agree with Shireen there, that just nurturing that space to do the kind of work that we want to do, not the kind of work that will be rewarded, hard as that is. But yeah, completely agree. But thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. And also thank you to Shireen. It's so lovely to see you. I just have to add, Shireen obviously supervised my PhD, so has played a very special and particular role in my own journey. And on that note, I hand back to Srila, who rejoined us. And thank you for allowing this to happen, Srila, also, and for enabling this. It's every time we do this, I learn so much. It's really, truly a wonderful thing.
Thank you. This was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you for going well over time. So I got kicked out and I could come back after trying like multiple different gadgets, but you know, such are the conditions under which we're doing this stuff. So thanks everyone. I see that we still have like 62 people with us. So I think it's okay that we've encroached on people's time. Thank you so much. And to both of you, I mean, I was going to look at the recording obviously anyway, but now I really have to, because I feel like I've just missed so much. But just picking up on, I think what you said at the end and right through, I was thinking of, you know, Claire Hemming's book, Why Stories Matter. And when she says, you know, the point of like feminist work is not just to write, you know, it's not just that corrective labor, right? It's not just about inserting women into the historical record. And if I remember clearly, she says, it's not just about telling different stories, but it's about telling stories differently. And I think that's what the session, you know, and the books are doing, because in a way, you know, just talking about the messiness, just talking about the intimacies between public and private and what gets ironed out and what doesn't. I think that's it. And it's so off the moment, right? Because we do have those stories of public women, at least of all written by these women themselves. But I think the point is now to then, you know, tell those stories differently. So thank you so much. I think in this moment of collective doom, nothing was better than to have two really inspiring women talk about two other really inspiring women. So thanks. And I'm so sorry, everyone. I'm so sorry we took long and that I got kicked out. Our next seminar will be on the 2nd of September, and we'll be joined by Nandita Datta and Durba Chatraj, who are our colleagues writing on India. They're going to talk about intimacy, space, and bodies. So I hope I'll see some of you there. Just to clarify, we have this awkward webinar license where unfortunately you as the audience can't share in the Q&A. I mean, you can't see, of course you can share questions, but you can't see the questions. And partly we did that because it allows us for greater numbers, but also not for Zoom hackers. And having actually encountered one of them, let me tell you, this is a small price to pay. But what we can try and do, and maybe Nehama as our technical team can apply herself to it, we can try and maybe collect the questions. So we have a script of them, and then obviously share them with the speakers, but maybe also share them to whoever's interested. Just feel free to email, or those of you who are on Twitter, you can just DM me. Okay, thanks so much. Thank you, Nehama. I'm so sorry I wasn't here. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Bye,
much.
everyone. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.